Hey there, welcome back to Faith, Frauds, and Falsehoods, where we explore various cults and religions of the world. Tonight, we're continuing our discussion on the Institute and Basic Life Principles, so don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to help others to find us.
Before we begin, let's make it very clear the opinions that we present are ours alone and do not represent the views or opinions of our respective churches or employers. Now let's begin.
All right. So, Matt, this brings us to the culmination of all of these many episodes that we've done on the IBLP. Tonight, we respond.
We tried something new. We turned this into a bunch of mini episodes. We're trying out some different things on this YouTube stuff.
Right. It's all new to us.
Yeah. Having some fun with it. This one we're just going to do all as one episode here. This is our response. So what does our response episode mean to you? Like, what do you see? Why do we do a response episode?
So, we added the response when we moved to YouTube, right, as a chance for us to step back and look at the whole of the organization, right? And to point out where people can see the problems that they have and try to avoid them from other groups in the future.
Okay.
That's how I think of our response episode, at least.
Looking through our notes here, I noticed this first part about the extremes. Did you write this part or did I write that part? Because I didn't write any notes, so I guess you wrote that part. But it sounds like something I would write.
I think you wrote the extremes and then I added notes to it.
Well, I noticed you wrote here, focusing on a punishment reward system versus Jesus and sinners in the hands of an angry God. I think you wrote that, but it sounds like something I would write.
Right.
So,
if it's something you might have wrote, what do you think? What's your thoughts?
I'm just pointing out that as much as we may disagree about some things, we also agree on a lot of things.
Oh, yeah.
And let's just be clear. I mean, I feel like we're doing it in different ways, but both of us have changed some of our views and our theological outlooks on things over the last few years.
Yep.
I think you changed some before I did, but more recently, I've really been focusing on what does this mean? What is that?
Right.
Yeah.
And I've probably changed more so than you have.
Yes. We're kind of going a little different directions.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm probably going a little more liberal than you are, and you're kind of going more towards traditional Christian.
Yeah.
You're really looking into what is the church? What's the history of the church? Where did this really happen? And that's kind of led to your finding the Orthodox Church, right?
Yep.
But both of us came from similar, but not exactly the same Baptist backgrounds. And I think that's what's been so hard. I'm going to get to this extremes thing here in a minute, but I just got to bring up the hard thing. That's what's been so hard about this group. As I've mentioned a little bit here, I never have studied IBLP or knew who Bill Gothard was. But absolutely, I have studied and taught, because I was given the materials to teach, some of this material.
Yep.
And we've talked as we've done this as a podcast and on YouTube, and I think we've talked about more on the podcast since we've moved to YouTube. There's some things I've done in my ministerial career that I regret. We talked about remaking some of the podcast episodes for YouTube. One we might ought to consider, now I'm thinking about it, is the Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that would be
I absolutely regret my participation in Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames and the disingenuous conversion of children, and this makes me think about those things. And so let's just be honest here. This has been difficult for me because it's made me really question some things, and it's made me really think, well, why do we do it this way? Well, we were taught this and we were taught Bible verses, but how do they really apply?
Right.
And it's really made me question some stuff. Not losing faith in Jesus whatsoever. Absolutely love Jesus. He's the Lord of my life. Not saying that, but maybe I don't love some of the teachers and pastors that I've had over the years. And
I think you love the people, but you don't love their teachings.
Some of the people.
You got to love all the people. You got to love all the people as hard as it is. You got to love all the people because that loves Jesus. That's how you love Jesus. That's what Jesus himself said.
He did tell us we had to forgive, right?
Yep.
But one of the things that the IBLP has really done is they've really pushed. So one of the things that I've learned in more and more, even recently, is the love of Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's probably why I lean a little more liberal than some folks. I wouldn't call myself a liberal Christian, but I definitely lean more towards the love of Jesus. I lean more towards away from the legalism and more towards the intention of things. You know?
Yep.
I don't think Jesus was teaching us a set of rules, do X, Y, and Z, and this is what you'll get. But that's exactly what the IBLP taught.
Yes.
I think Bill Gothard was trying to was trying to help people, but what he taught people ended up becoming extra biblical and not biblical. As much as he might have called it fundamentalism and might have called it conservatism and might have said, this is all straight from the Bible, he pick and chose these things. And what he turned it into was, if I do X and Y, I'll get Z. And that is exactly what Jesus taught against. That's the message of the Pharisees.
It is.
And that is not what Jesus was teaching.
Yep, the Pharisees and the Judaizers.
Yeah. And you wrote here, sinners in the hands of an angry God.
Yeah. So do you remember that sermon? Do you remember anything about that sermon from Jonathan Edwards?
No.
Oh, so that's
but go ahead.
Yeah. It's a very famous sermon in which the kind of the depiction is a very angry God, right? Who's just looking for the reason to strike you down and send you to hell, right? I remember being taught at one point, right, kind of the idea of a spider on a web and God's just waiting to cut it and drop you into the fire, right? It's a very legalistic, puritanical, moral holiness kind of thing of you do things the right way or God will punish you.
I heard a woman today who was part of IBLP said that when she was 6 years old, she was taught that if she didn't pray the sinner's prayer, then she would burn in a lake of fire, and so she would lose her parents.
Yep, that's which is not biblical, but that's a different episode.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but it's not exactly a different episode because this is our response, okay?
Okay.
So this is exactly what we're talking about. That is not biblical. That is not what Jesus taught. And you're talking about this angry God thing. We absolutely should fear God, but not fear that he's here to hurt us. He's God.
Right.
He is the supreme being, creator, sovereign Lord of the universe. Okay. They're going to have some fear of that. But God has also done wonderful things for people. We are his beloved. As far as I understand it, human beings are the highest, greatest creature that God has created. We're above the angels. Yep. And I won't even go off into the tangent about people dying and becoming angels because they don't.
Right. Nope, they sure don't.
But he is not here to try to hurt us. He's not this whole hammer over our head. But what Gothard built was this whole thing about if you want to live life well, you do these things. And look, some of those things I even agree with, but not because I think God will hurt you if you don't do those things. Some of those things are good to do.
They're just good things. Yep.
Some of his family teachings went too extreme, but a good, strong family is important for happiness. Let me just be straight up. I don't believe that God designed families to work as single parents.
Nope.
I don't hate single parents. I was raised by a single parent. My mama worked super hard to do the very best she could. But you know what? We missed out on some things because my father wasn't a parent. Okay? That is not how it's supposed to be. So encouraging people to, get married and marry the right person and, stay together and raise the kids right, that's a good thing. That's not exactly what Gothard encouraged. I think that was what he intended. But that's not exactly what he ended up encouraging. Good, strong families is not a bad thing. Big families is not a bad thing.
Right.
I love children. As I told you earlier in this podcast, we've practiced some of the quiverful things. The Lord has not blessed us with lots of children, but we've done nothing to stop such a thing because we want the Lord to bless us.
Yep.
But as we say the quiverful thing, we heard other things that were more disturbing of women who had severe medical problems, but because they were quiverful, they couldn't do anything to not have a child.
Right.
Including simple stuff like don't create the child in the first place. I'm not talking about, certain drugs or something even, and I'm definitely not talking about abortion. It's just it's the extremism of it. The extremism is what took it too far.
Yep. And that's what we see. Really, I mean, this is a common thread among many, many cults, especially the cults who claim some level of Christianity, right? They take one thread, right, one piece, and they take it so far to the extreme that they're way outside the guideposts of the church, right? And it bears down, right? And they experience the rewards from that. And in this case, the reward was,
and I don't want
to sin.
I don't want to focus on the church or depict the church as some sort of moderate something all the time.
Right.
But I will say that moderate stuff is a lot of what Jesus taught.
Mm-hmm.
When the disciples were picking in the field whenever they shouldn't have been, he was being more practical and not just a stickler for the rules.
Yeah.
The Bible tells us to not be drunken, and then there's people drinking wine, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's moderate stuff that's okay. It's the extremism that becomes the problem.
Yep. Extremes one way or the other. Yep.
This cult's so hard because when we studied, say, Manson or Jim Jones, it's like, well, why did y'all do that? They went way far off. We did Tony Alamo.
Uh-huh.
We talked about having some personal connections with Tony Alamo, or at least part of that group and stuff. And well, how did they get that far off? And we also, well, they started little and then they build. Yep. Even Westboro, they started a little and they build and they got more and more extreme. This group got extreme too. But on the outside, that's one of the name of the documentary, Shiny Happy People. They look like shiny happy people.
Yep.
They don't look
they
bad
didn't
from the
look
outside.
like a cult. Right.
Right. What's the one we did? Heaven's Gate.
Heaven's Gate. Yep.
They looked like a cult. Dude had some crazy cult eyes. They all looked the same. Yeah. They looked like a cult. Granted, the IBLP people dress a little more plainly, a little more modestly, but they don't look like a cult. They look like a family. There's a lot of families that dress modestly. That in itself is not a bad thing. But whenever you push that so far that you make women into victims, and you make it that if something happens to them, they're the victim and it's their fault because they made some man do something bad to them, we went to the extreme.
Yep.
I could keep on that, but we're trying to keep this under 30 minutes. So I'm going to go on to the deconstruction versus disentanglement.
Yeah. So tell me, how are you defining these two words? Because I know what I think they mean.
So Jill Duggar mentioned this in her book, and her book's a little different than some of the other people who have come out of the IBLP because, her husband's a pastor. Her and her husband both work in ministry in John MacArthur's church, actually.
Oh, okay.
Now, is where they ended up at. When she married him, he was a pastor of a church, and now I think he's like a youth pastor or college pastor or something at John MacArthur's church. And he never was IBLP, by the way, but he started learning it so he could marry her, basically, because her parents wanted him to know about it. Not necessarily to convert to it or something. It wasn't really like that. Yeah,
because it was just a parachurch ministry. It wasn't like a...
And her parents allowed them to marry people who weren't exactly all into IBLP. I think her mom and dad was trying to do the best they could,
Right.
And she thinks that. But this deconstruction versus entanglement, she says that a lot of her friends went through this deconstruction thing, and that's pretty popular right now. It's where you kind of examine your faith and look at the church you were taught growing up. And a lot of people end up leaving deconstruction and leave their faith too.
Right.
Not everybody, but a lot of people do. She titles what she went through as disentanglement, meaning she disentangled herself from the extra biblical stuff, from the stuff that had nothing to do with Jesus. So she still believes in Jesus. She still believes in the Bible, for instance, but she believes that Gothard taught stuff that really wasn't the Bible, even though he claimed it was, that he used verses out of context. She fully acknowledges that she doesn't understand everything, and there's a lot of ways to look at stuff, but she's continually to learn and to look into it.
Right.
So that's where she called that disentanglement rather than deconstruction, because she's not trying to take apart her faith. She's just trying to disentangle her stuff from the bad stuff.
Okay. I get that.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of a practical example where you got to kind of weed out the bad things. I keep thinking of like a weed eater, but that don't make sense.
Right. Yeah. So while I can see that being beneficial for some people, right? I don't know that it's necessarily the best path forward to apply to everyone, right? Because how does one discern the good from the bad?
Well,
right? And so you're saying, okay, I'm not going to keep this piece, but I am going to keep this piece, right? Because you're saying that this piece is entangling this one, so we're getting rid of this. But what if this one's also wrong? Right? I don't know if you can see my hands. I'm talking with my hands.
Right,
I always talk with my hands.
Well, and you may cut that off in the video with our little circles,
right.
but
yeah.
Well, in her case, she read through the scripture for herself, studied the scripture for herself, and seeked out people in her church and other church leaders who have studied that same stuff. You know, not looking at just Gothard as the only source of everything.
Right.
She talked about when she was a little girl, Gothard coming by the house, and she was so excited he was coming. He brought a delegation of some like people from foreign countries, some mayors from somewhere. And she wanted to play kickball with him. When they seen him as a prophet, he never called himself such, but they had seen him as such. And that is how he was able to get to those little girls and those young women that he molested, was because he was seen as a prophet. He's the one
who held power. Yep.
Right. She talked about, the seven
principles.
Seven principles. How she used that to gauge everything in her life over and over again. And when she met other Christians who didn't use the seven principles, she felt bad for them, and as if they didn't really know everything. They didn't have the secret.
Yep.
They didn't have the seven principles, so they could not be as successful in life because of it.
Yeah.
So,
well, for me, right, I don't think that I went through deconstruction, right? Partially, but I also didn't just go through a disentanglement, right? I have sat down, I guess it probably is more of a deconstruction, and sought to find out what the historic teachings have been on all these different things, right? Not just what do I think this verse says, or what do I think that this chapter says, or what does my pastor think, or whatever the case may be, because as we've seen, right, here recently, some of my pastors were wrong in the way that they talked about things. But I sat down and I started looking for what has the church for the last 2,000 years taught, right? So maybe you could say it was deconstruction to the point of, see, when I think of deconstruction, I think of tear it all down and build it back up, right? This was more of a lateral, I feel like I'm on the wrong foundation, and so I stepped over to a different foundation, right? The foundation that is Christ through the church.
Well, and this is that definition thing, right? As we kind of change definition,
right?
Like I think of deconstruction, I don't think of build it back up, because that's reconstruction, right?
Yeah.
But tear it all down. But I definitely see what you're talking about. And I think part of the complication in what you're describing is what the church has taught for 2,000 years. Okay. But as you've talked about many times, the church has not taught the same thing for 2,000 years. Things have learned and grown. There have been some changes over those 2,000 years.
There has not been theological doctrinal changes over the last 2,000 years. There have been new things that have come about, but nothing that was previously canonized has been changed.
Okay, so you're talking all after canonization.
Right.
But before the canonization, that took several hundred years. There was changes, right?
I mean, you'd have to define changes, but I think that's getting us into a rabbit trail. A discussion for us to have at lunch.
Well, my point is, where I'm getting to with this is, when I went to what very little seminary I've done, which was a Baptist seminary,
right.
One thing they did teach us was that I thought was great was the whole objectiveness to look at different sources and different ways of looking at things whenever you're preparing. They very much push the don't believe what your pastor says. One thing about Baptists is that while sometimes we get off in this little thing like IBLP, a lot of people that were Baptists got into IBLP.
Yeah.
As a whole, or I don't know, some of them really push the whole independent freedom thing, which is kind of the side that I lean on, and the whole question everything thing. We were taught to use a concordance, but not one concordance, use several. We were taught to look at several things, because there isn't one source. And I realize you went kind of more to the one source thing mostly, but we were taught to look at it in different ways. And I feel like none of these IBLP people were doing any of that.
Right.
They weren't looking at that. It was very much pushed to me. I know there are Baptists who are like KJV only, but I never came from that strand. I was always taught, look at multiple translations. They came from different places. And maybe some translations you consider more factual than others or what have you. Because of the way they were translated. Not every translation of the Bible was meant to be exact. It just wasn't meant to be. They were translated for different reasons.
I think in our podcast, in one of the podcast episodes, we had a whole long discussion on translation. So go back and listen to all of our old podcasts over on your favorite podcast platform and find that for us and let us know. Because I don't remember which episode we talked about that in. But I know that we talked about translation.
Yeah,
and that there is no one-for-one translation. So
my point is, we were taught to use multiple different things to look at these things on there. And that goes back to the whole IBLP thing. They were taught to use those same 7 things over and over again.
Over and over. Yep.
And to use Gothard's interpretation of everything.
Yep. Which takes us to our next point, Matt, since we've got to stay within the 30 minutes.
Yes, and we're at 22 minutes.
Are they a cult?
I think so.
We have our criteria, right? We defined them back on the podcast and probably redefine them in our intro to YouTube. If not, we need to do a special episode just for that.
You just want to do infographics.
I do. I like infographics. But our first criteria is misplaced authority, right? And, we're sitting here talking about how Gothard made himself the end-all, be-all for this group, right? That's a misplaced authority. There should never be that much authority granted to a single person over this group, over
here's the funny
Christian
thing.
Group.
Unlike a lot of other cult leaders we've talked about, he never told the people he was the authority.
Right. He just
sounded good. He never said, I'm God, or I'm the prophet, or any of that stuff. As far as I can tell, I never caught him saying anything like that.
Right.
But they gave him that authority because he was the one teaching.
Yep. Yeah. In this case, if you remember back when we talked about Manson, maybe it was Scientology. I don't remember. We talked about the difference between power and authority, right? And power is something that's seized and held over people, whereas authority is something that's granted. I give you authority over me. And that's exactly what happened here. The people gave him the authority without him even asking.
And because he taught them that he had the authority, not him himself, but the one teaching you has the authority.
The one teaching has the authority. Yep.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so he might have manipulated it to be that, but they granted it to him.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what's our next step here?
Eschatological error, right? Errors about the end of days, the day of the Lord, the return of Christ, etc. And honestly, for them, since they're not considering themselves a church or anything like that, there wasn't a lot of teaching on eschatology. There's probably something on his site somewhere that you could dig and find, but given the rest of their history, they're probably fairly Baptist, fundamentalist, dispensationalist of some sort. So nothing that's there that would be so overtly extreme, right? Not like a spaceship is coming to take us away, like Heaven's Gate. So beyond that is soteriological error. Do you remember what soteriological means, Matt?
I don't do definitions of words that have 15 characters.
Salvation issues.
Now he's counting the characters, y'all.
Yep. I thought about it, but I figured I had to speak. So this is issues around salvation, right? And in one of their what we believe things from some web archive page that I found at some point, it talks about Christ taking the penalty for our sins, which to me leans towards penal substitutionary atonement, which is a very poor way to view salvation, but is the norm amongst many Protestants today, right?
So most Americans who call themselves Christian, this is their view.
Right. Yep. They fall into this PSA at some level, right?
So I wouldn't call them a cult based on just that sort of thing.
Right. Exactly. Yep. So this does not, doesn't qualify them as a cult. The rest of their explanation is salvation is by grace. And then modification of vocabulary. He didn't tweak words, right? Which is generally what we see in these groups is they take and say, well, this word really means that, right? So he didn't do that intentionally, right? Nothing that I could find.
I think some could argue he did some of that. They didn't really have their own. We didn't have to pull up our own vocabulary for this group.
Right.
But part of that's because we were already familiar with some of the vocabulary he uses.
True. Yeah. So
I got to kind of admit that a little bit. We were already familiar with the terminology and things. And one of the victims I heard talking about dyslexia's hitting me. The concept of being modesty.
Oh yeah.
About how his definition of things would change over time, and modesty was an example.
True.
At one time, modesty was a certain level, and you dress a certain way, and then later, modesty changed. So that's this is as much vocabulary as this concept, but that definitely changed over time, probably over his own preferences.
Right. Which I mentioned in the next piece, right? The mistaught concepts, right? So while he didn't necessarily change words, right, or the meanings of words, he changed the way that they're applied, right? And I don't think that he intended to start a cult in 1961. I don't think that was his goal, right?
I don't think so either.
There are some that we've looked at that was their goal.
I think that he's seen this and thought, hey, I can see these things and I can help people.
Yep.
And then he was helping people.
Yep. But his own inability to understand some of these concepts meant that he kind of fell apart when it came time to present it elsewhere.
Well, and I think his own inability to maintain a relationship with God, a relationship with Jesus, led him to take himself astray, which corrupted the thing from the beginning. As we talked about, we knew about the scandal later on, but then the earlier scandal with him and his brother.
Yep.
And as I kept mentioning that scandal, he was also messing around with secretaries and everything. As soon as he got a little bit of power, he started doing sinful things. And not just by his own standards, but by God's standards too. And I feel like that he wasn't in a right relationship with Jesus himself. Right. And so I think he's been off for a long time, and he went off on this whole other tangent and led a bunch of people with him, So definitely there's some mistaught concepts there because he had a mistaught heart himself.
Yeah.
Did you want to go over this next part as well?
Yeah. I had kind of hoped that you'd throw some notes in there so I knew what to ask you about. But
I think we've talked about most all of those things that's listed there. We talked about the centralized authority. We versus they. We talk about that. We versus they. they definitely were a we versus they. They made themselves elite. They were better than other people. They had the path. Again, it wasn't so much about salvation as it was about living a good life. Mm-hmm. And if you stepped out of these things that he taught, you were open for Satan to attack.
Right.
Isn't that a weird concept that, like you said, the angry God is just ready to get you. Yep. All right, God's just going to turn you over to Satan to devour you then.
Right.
The isolationist exclusiveness, they were kind of isolation exclusiveness. Almost practically had to be from the concepts they were taught with the big families and the mom has to stay at home because they got so many children and everything. Right. That's going to happen a little bit. Elitism, yeah, they're a little bit elite. Proselytizing, yeah, they were encouraging other people to live like them and bring them in. I was listening to a podcast today where the lady was talking about she had gotten married and she was struggling in her marriage for it to work, mainly because her husband was horrible and beating her. But she also had a child or two, and she was trying to raise her children right and trying to make her marriage work. She was taught it was her fault because her husband was acting like that. And she was in the nursing room at church where they brought in the nursing babies and stuff. Keep them quiet during service and that sort of thing. Right. And there were some mothers in there who are IBLP mothers, and she started asking them for advice because the Bible says young women should ask the older women, for advice in church. She was doing what she was taught and to the very best. Yeah. They present themselves as happy, shiny people, as an example of this. And so she went to them as an example, and things got worse in her life because of it. Definitely outside our current cultural norms. Right. And yeah, they're labeled as a cult by others. I don't think originally they were. I think a lot of churches were very accepting to them. I think now if you were to go in, the IBLP wants to do something in your church, a lot of churches would reject that. Yep. But the way they grew this organization was by going to an area and visiting local pastors and talking to them and getting local pastors. There were pastors all around this country of churches, small and big, who encourage their people to go to these IBLP gatherings. Yeah.
So I think what we're coming down to, right, is the final question, Matt, of are they a cult?
I think they're a cult.
I think they're a cult. I do.
I don't think it's as strict a definition as some of the other cults, but I think they are definitely a cult. Yep. The organization still exists. And while they don't teach as extreme things, they're still teaching things that aren't right. Right. And so I think they're too big to fail, and they can't just disappear. And so they still exist. I think they're going to fail more because this happy, shiny people thing came out, and more lights on it, and more families leave, and more kids that are growing up in it won't continue. Right. And even the Duggars, which were their shining example, several of their children have left this at this point. Right.
So how many red juice drinks do you give them?
Not Kool-Aid. It was Flavor Aid. The Kool-Aid Corporation would like us to mention. I would say 3 out of 5.
See,
they weren't a doomsday cult.
Right. I was thinking like 2.5. They fit the cult criteria, right? But they're not as extreme as Manson or Scientology or Heaven's Gate.
I could definitely see myself having gotten involved in a group like this and then 10, 20 years later been like, oh, what was I involved in? Right. Their family values are not all that different from my own. So I definitely see this is one of the closest cults I've been to, honestly. Right. So you're saying 2.5, I'm saying 3, huh? Yeah.
Okay. So we'll just shoot for somewhere in that range.
Somewhere in that range.
Picture. Yep.
All right. Well, thank y'all. I had a great segue here that I forgot about our next cult.
Yeah. But our next cult, we're going to go back to kind of the 4 or 5 episodes a month, right? We talked about that before we got started tonight.
Instead of 20 or 30 or whatever we got now.
Yeah. We thought it would be a good idea, but it turned out to be a whole lot more work on us and on me in particular for editing it all. So we're going to just kind of go back. We'll try and keep the episodes into this 30-minute range like we have tonight, or a little bit over, but not too bad. And so we're talking about NXIVM.
branding. Branding is very important for lots of things, especially if you're a cult leader. You should brand your people. That's what they thought. We'll find out more on the next episode.